A lot of couples that I've spoken to have gone through IVF not even realizing that this could be a consequence. You go through it so fixated on having your family, and when it's successful, it's a miracle and it's amazing. And then you all of a sudden are confronted with this question of what do you want to do with your extra embryos?
This is Sick Health with Kevin Ban, MD. Our show helps you navigate our confusing healthcare system so you can take control of your own health. Today, I connected with my friend Joanna Weiss, and we took the show in a different direction. Up until now, I focused on healthcare, and today we went outside the four walls of healthcare into other topics. We talk about her new band, the Lazy Susans. We talk about robots and their use in supermarkets and in healthcare. We dive deep into in vitro fertilization, embryo donation, and other IVF-related issues. And then we land on a medical bill that my wife got. And I tell the story of how we navigated through that. Joanna is a very accomplished person. She worked at the Boston Globe for over 16 years. She's a freelance writer for Politico, and she currently works at Northeastern, where she focuses on strategic communications. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Joanna Weiss, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Finally, we got you here on Sick Health with Kevin Ban, MD. Actually, folks, I'm going to change the name from Sick Health with Kevin Ban, MD to Well Defined with Kevin Ban, MD. What do you think?
Well defined. I love that.
Do you
I
like
love
it?
I endorse.
Good. You and I have been doing this for a while together. In fact, when we first met, we did a podcast together, Decoding
That is how we
Healthcare.
met. Yep.
And that's like, when is that? Like 16, 17?
Probably 2017. We were both working for a company called Athena Health.
And it was so much fun.
It was so fun.
Now, it's for healthcare wonks, especially those interested in population health management. I think half of the people listening to this now just fell asleep.
But we made it fun. But we talked about things like scurvy. That's the thing I remember the most, is you told this story about how back in whatever it was, the 1800s, nobody could figure out why sailors were dying of scurvy when they were out on these ships. It was this horrible, dread disease that would like suck you dry from the inside. And it turned out that it was citrus. Someone figured out that it was lack of citrus that was causing scurvy. And I do not recall what that had to do with population health, but it had something really pertinent to do with it.
The interesting thing about that is that you didn't need much citrus. It could be lemon or limes, and a teaspoon would do it. And a physician in the British Navy figured this out. What's really tragic about this story is that this became life-saving, but it took like 50 years or something ridiculous for the British Navy to say to everyone, hey, you need to have a teaspoon of citrus when we're out on the seas.
And that was it. That was the point, was that there are these great solutions. There can be great healthcare innovations, but without getting it out to the public and circulated in the right way through the establishment, it could never happen.
And
Or people could die in the meantime.
And that's what can be really frustrating about healthcare. But the needle you're trying to thread is that not one study is really definitive. And I really can't remember any time where one study changed the practice of medicine. So as a community, we tend to be very conservative because we're protecting people's lives. The flip side of that is sometimes it takes forever to get really basic good care out in the
Right.
communities, which is frustrating.
Well, drink your orange juice, or maybe just straight out of the orange, right? Eat your citrus every
Even
day.
better. Yeah.
Vitamin C.
Yeah. Just go whole foods. All right. So tell us about the Lazy Susans and what that's all about.
The Lazy Susans, yes. Maybe it all ties into healthcare in the sense that doing crazy things at any point in your life probably makes you healthier and happier in some way, because this is just a crazy thing that I did very unexpectedly at an age that I didn't think I'd be doing anything like this because of a pandemic. Okay, so I'm not a musician. I took piano lessons as a dutiful child, but clearly it wasn't going to be my life or my day job. I did not have that kind of skill and talent or dedication. So I went on to other things. Happened to marry a really good musician who was in bands for as long as I've known him. And I had a bunch of friends in my town. We live in Milton, Massachusetts in the early 2000s. We all had babies at the same time and met up with this group of friends who all had babies at the same time. And when you have a baby, you need adult conversation very, very badly. And so we sort of joined up as a group and would get together every Friday night and have pizza and adult conversation. For 20 years, our kids grew up together and we were this kind of unit with a lot of the husbands playing music all the time. Like some of them were real musicians and some of them would just get the guitar out and play after dinner. And the wives, we, did the dishes and we drove the kids to music lessons. We were supportive of all the wonderful musical talents in our families, but we were busy and it wasn't our thing. And we had never done anything like that. And it was somebody else's thing. Pandemic hits. All of a sudden, we are weirdly less busy because there are no carpools and no one's driving to work. And there's also this existential thing that happens when you are staring a pandemic in the face and saying, I don't know how much time I have. And individually, all of us had been like, that looks like fun. You sit your kids in the Little Mermaid at the community theater and you're cheering, yay. And you're like, that'd be kind of fun to be up there. And here I am in the audience. So we just decided, let's go in the basement and do a rock band. Why not? And we had all this equipment. I have drums in my house and amps. And so there are 5 of us and we came down and the drummer had never played drums before, but had always loved drums. And the bass player had never picked up a bass before. The keyboard player had studied classical piano, but had never done rock piano. And I had played, like 3 chords on the acoustic guitar, but I had never played an electric guitar. And we were like, let's just do it. A lot of northeastern towns have this little music festival once a year called Porch Fest, which is a really cool event. It's basically like a neighborhood open mic where people have people on their front lawns or on their porches and they invite bands to play music and people will walk around and they'll have a beer and they'll go from house to house and see people playing music. And our town had a Porch Fest. And one of my friends, as we'd been playing for like 3 weeks and we're horrible, was like, you know what? We should play at Porch Fest, which was at that point maybe 6 months away. We were like, you're insane. But we did it. We decided to do it. And that gave us a deadline, which is key to accomplishing anything.
So that's one of the things about transformational change. Like there's all this literature around it. And one of the things that always stays with me is you have to sense or you have to create a sense of urgency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you do a bunch of different things, but one of the most important things you do is you like say to people, we've got to do this thing now because if we don't do this thing now, like bad things are going to happen. And as I'm saying that, it makes me think like the bad thing that's going to happen is you're going to end up on that day and like that dream I have where I haven't studied for the exam and I've got to
Oh,
take
yeah.
it like would be your reality.
Oh, we thought, yes, there is a very strong chance that we are going to completely humiliate ourselves in front of our friends, our neighbors, our children. And so we had better get our act together. And so we did. And we put together like 7 cover songs and they were rock songs. And we got up there on the porch and we thought, okay, maybe, 10 people will come and friends will come. It happened to be a beautiful day. It was the first of these events since the pandemic. So it was this kind of neighborhood coming out party. And there were 300 people in the street dancing as we were playing like a kind of slow version of We Got the Beat by the Go-Go's. We're
Oh
like
yeah.
Gen X women,
Great
so we're
tune.
doing all these like 80s songs. And it was insane. It was so much fun. It was completely insane. We were 100% unqualified to do it, but we did it. So fast forward, I'm a journalist. I wrote a story for Boston Magazine about it, just saying, here's this crazy thing I did. And it got the attention of the Kelly Clarkson show, which was at that point out in LA. They were looking for Mother's Day content. So they were looking for stories about moms doing unusual things. And here's where it gets to me. Here's where I get on my soapbox a little bit, because how many bands do you know, Kevin, made up of dads, middle-aged guys who are just like played guitar and they're a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
Women don't do that. It's just very rare for women to decide to do that. And so I think there was something weirdly unusual about it that got the attention of a producer from the Kelly Clarkson show who happened to text me one night while I was in a rehearsal. Like we were all in my basement playing because I think we had a gig coming up because we were like, we're going to keep going. This is fun. So I get this text. I send her a selfie. She says, can you get on a Zoom call? We're sitting around my basement. We crack a bottle of wine. We fire up a Zoom. We talk to this producer from the Kelly Clarkson show. She says, can you come out next Tuesday so that we could film a show on Wednesday. And we
Wow.
all take out our phones and we start looking, "I don't know, I have soccer carpool that I have to drive," and I do and finally my friend Heather said, who's the bass player, says, "Stop it. We are going. Put
Yeah,
your
and maybe
phones down."
soccer carpool can be put
Yeah,
on
yeah,
hold
yeah.
so that we can fly to California and be on television about our new band.
So long story long, after buying out the mall because you have to figure out what to wear on the Kelly Clarkson show, we got our instruments and bags and we fly out and we play for the outro of the show with Kelly Clarkson's amazing band, and we had this crazy TV moment that has spun into some other crazy things.
Well, it doesn't end here. Amy Adams, is that her name? Picked this up and you guys are in a development deal.
We are working on a development deal through a company called Tawari Entertainment Group. We are having a great time. We are still playing. We are writing songs. The main message we want to send people is if you want to do something, particularly something creative, but if there's something that you've always thought that might be fun to do it. Just do it. Don't wait. And it helps to do it with your friends and it helps to set a deadline.
You know, it's one of the pieces of advice that I give to people. I become a bit of a lightning rod for physicians in particular who think that they might like to continue to practice medicine, but maybe do some other things. And one of the things I say is like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You've got this great gig going on. You don't have to just jump into the next thing. And usually the advice is do something. And I don't care what it is, just do something. Usually it's related to medicine, whether it's advising an early stage company or sitting on a board, do something. Because my experience is, and that's what you guys did, when you do something, things happen, right? But you can't micromanage the outcome of where it needs to go. This is really key.
Right.
You're going to do
Right.
something, but you can't decide where it's going to go or what it's going to be. You just do it and you make sure, number two, that you enjoy doing it.
If we had done this with the expectation of being on a TV show, first of all, we would have been insane, and it wouldn't you're you're gonna be disappointed. It's never gonna work out that way. So, yeah, for us, we're fortunate, right? It's not our day jobs. Everything is gravy. Everything that has happened, all these weird encounters and conversations and opportunities that we've had have all been extra and gravy, but the important thing is kind of keeping to your core, why are we doing this? And we're constantly reminding ourselves. So you always have to go back to what is the purpose of this thing that I've decided to do? Why am I doing it? For us, it is we are enjoying being together and we are enjoying the creative process of playing music. If you hold on to that and your reason for doing it is always in your mind and is always first priority, everything else will fall into place or it won't. And it won't matter because you're doing it for the right reason.
You know, I think that's a great message. And I think I'm going to land here on the story of the Lazy Susans until, of course, that movie gets made or the TV show or whatever it ends up being. And then we're bringing it back.
We'll hook you up with a little cameo. You can be the doctor who comes in and, I don't know, diagnoses someone.
I love that. Like you've already typecasted me into that. I've got to be the doctor. But
All right, you
okay,
are okay. How is that typecasting? But okay, we'll
I
move
couldn't
on.
be the exceptionally cool middle-aged guy. I'm about to say middle-aged guy. I'm like, wow, that's overly generous to call myself.
You're the guy in the pickup truck who goes by and yells at something at us.
I love
Is
that.
that better?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
because I
good.
actually have the pickup truck that I could drive by in, albeit a hybrid Ford F-150. Okay, one of the things I'm curious about, and I'm transitioning here, is how you choose articles. I mean, I read robots,
Boston Magazine, I did a story about a robot in a supermarket.
and then recently you published something in Politico, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Now I'm completely lost
Well,
all
let's see if you
confidence.
get the article right, but keep going.
Yeah, you talk about embryos and IVF and where it's going, and I wanna talk about both of those. First, robots, but before we even get into either of them, like, how do you even decide what to write about?
Yeah, I mean, I write generally as a freelancer, and so I'm fortunate to be able to pitch stories when I want to pitch them, and it starts with an obsession, right? It starts with what is it that's fascinated me, and sometimes it's something that I won't even realize has been an obsession, but I think back and I think, for the last 6 months, I've just kind of been churning over something in my mind. And the thing about a magazine story is and I say this as someone who's been a magazine editor too, so this is kind of now we get philosophical. A magazine story is about the thing it's about, and it's about the meaning of life. And so for the supermarket story, there's a local supermarket chain in the Boston area called Stop and Shop that has had since about 2019 a roving robot that goes through the aisles, and it's a little bit unclear to the lay customer what this robot is doing or why it is there. I first encountered it somewhere in the pandemic era, like around 2020 when I was in the supermarket in my mask, and I see this like giant, it's almost 7 feet tall, this entity that comes rolling down the aisle, and it has googly eyes, which I will get to. And I was like backing in the opposite direction because I was so freaked out by it. I was churning over in my head, like, what is this thing? And then started to learn by doing a little Googling that this robot had a name. And by about 2023, 2024, it had started to be making public appearances. Like it had become a bit of a mascot for the supermarket chain. And I
Yeah.
thought, how did it get there? And at the same time, we're all thinking in our daily lives about the increased amount of automation that we see everywhere, especially in the workplace. As employees, as customers, we are encountering robots. I've been to sushi restaurants where the sushi comes on a conveyor belt. There are robots that are in the Amazon warehouse helping people get the things off of the shelves. In large and small ways, robots are interacting with us and are part of our daily lives. And so I've been really fascinated with how you design a robot that people want to be around, how people react to robots, how to make those robot human interactions more pleasant and more productive than the initial interaction that I had with this robot where I was backing in the opposite direction,
I
freaking
mean,
out.
I know exactly what you're talking about because this robot is creepy as can be.
I've come to love him, I have to tell you, like, spoiler alert, I've come to love him.
Well, that's the whole story here, right? His name is Marty, which is an acronym.
Yes, he started out without a name, which is an interesting part of the story. It was created by a robotics company hired by the supermarket chain to do one task, which was to identify spills in the aisles so that they could alert a human to come and clean up a spill because they had determined that there were hazards sometimes in the aisle and it took a while for a human to get there. And the robot can't do it because the robot doesn't have arms. The robot's like this roving cylinder. So they deploy as a pilot this long, tall, rolling robot that has LiDAR, which is like a laser guided navigation system and cameras, and they roll it down the supermarket aisles. And in one supermarket in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, there's a store associate who sees this thing and says, there's something missing, leaves her shift, comes back from a craft store with a pair of giant googly eyes and attaches them to the robot. All of a sudden, this robot has a face and the store chain realizes this is a good idea and gives the robot a name, Marty, which stands for Mobile Automated Robot Technology or something like that, which fits in very well with a supermarket robot. And all of a sudden, Marty is an entity. He has eyes, he has a face. They put a little sticker smile on him. And they notice that kids in the supermarket are going up to him. They love him. Adults are still backing off in the opposite direction. The store associates are very skeptical because they don't want their jobs taken by this robot. Kids love him.
You know, this is something, as you tell this story, that I saw in healthcare. I have a friend who works at Boston Children's Hospital, Peter Weinstock, and he does really innovative things around simulation. And they started to use robots for kids. They have child life specialists who, while kids are going through really difficult illnesses, will help them. But the problem is they just don't have enough child life specialists. And so the question is like, how can we scale that person's impact on the kid? And the answer ended up being with these robots. Kids
Wow.
love them and they found them comforting and they wanted them to be a part of their care team.
Well, I think it's happened, it may be Japan, that robots have been deployed into senior citizens' homes to be a kind of a healthcare companion slash aid. So maybe it's the robot who tells you it's time to take your pills, and maybe the robot can even dispense the pills. But you could imagine some individual healthcare uses for these robots as long as there's buy-in. And it has to do with the robot's design, and it has to do with educating people about what the robot is and what it wants to do and what it can't do. And there's some trial and error. There have been decisions made about Marty the supermarket robot. Like, he doesn't have a voice, it doesn't talk, it doesn't advertise for the weekly circular. You know what its boundaries are. And I think that helps with the definition of the relationship between the people and the robot.
And yet somehow when you are around this robot, you've got this sense that there's something behind that face that's real and that could react to you, yet it never does. So where does this story go then? Marty becomes a local celebrity.
It happens in stages. First, the supermarket chain realizes that it just dropped these robots into stores and customers were reacting the way I did, being freaked out. And so they needed to do a better job of rolling out this robot. So a year or so after it was deployed into stores, they threw Marty a first birthday party in the stores, and they brought coloring books and cake and balloons, and they found that, again, kids were coming in with pictures they had drawn with crayon of Marty. People were bringing Marty presents. Some adult brought Marty a can of WD-40. People were just buying into this. I think partly because, wow, supermarket shopping is kind of an annoying task. And if something weird is happening in the supermarket, it just makes your day a little bit better. So customers were responding positively to Marty. Then a year or two later, the supermarket chain, which is Stop and Shop, was doing a charity event in conjunction with Dana-Farber Cancer Center
Yeah.
in Boston.
Yeah.
And they had a child ambassador, a little boy who was a cancer survivor, and he was part of this day of promotion, and they learned that the boy loved robots. And so they took Marty from a store. They drove up to his house in a Stop and Shop delivery truck. Marty rolls off the truck up to the boy's front door. The boy comes out, gives the robot this enormous hug. And again, the Stop and Shop marketing people are like, So all of a sudden, Marty becomes an ambassador. He goes to Fenway Park in Boston. He rolls out onto the warning track on a day to promote an event. He goes to a retail industry convention somewhere like Orlando, and he's there taking selfies with people. He's part of a telethon in Rhode Island to raise money. So he's just kind of out and about being an ambassador, this unlikely symbol of the supermarket. He still is, meanwhile, still working. He has a task
Right.
in it.
He's
And
got a job in the store.
he's got 2 jobs in the store now because he got trained. He got programmed/trained, depending on how much you want to anthropomorphize him, which for me is a lot. So he has a job where every morning he scans the shelves. He
Oh,
wakes
right.
up
Yeah.
at 5 in the morning and he scans the shelves to see if there are missing items, and he sends that data to an app. And he also is still looking for spills. So he's in the store, but the supermarket chain has realized that there is this appeal of this giant weird robot with googly eyes that represents, I don't know, weirdness, food, whatever you want him to be. Marty is for you.
What's really interesting about it, and I'm going to tie it back to what we were discussing earlier, which is like you do something, right? In this case, it was to identify spills. And then all of a sudden, this other thing happens, which is getting back to the point of like you guys start jamming in the basement, and then this other thing happens, which
Yeah.
you could not have anticipated.
And you learn to roll with it. Literally, when you're a rolling robot. Yes.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I'm going to transition now into something that is a little bit heavier than a robot. And that is the whole concept of IVF embryos, specifically the donation of embryos. Joanna, one of the things I've always loved about you as a writer, and I should mention parenthetically, you're a great writer and I really enjoy your stuff.
And you're a great doctor.
At least allegedly. You follow your curiosity and you're always learning and interested in something, and you think about it for a while, and then you turn it into language and usually an ass-kicking article. And you've done that with embryo donation and IVF. This is one of those areas recently that has been so fraught with politics that sometimes we lose sight of where we agree. I'm reminded of Jimmy Kimmel when 6, 7 years ago, he talked about his son who was born with tetralogy of Fallot, which is a heart disease. And he essentially got on and he talked about how scary this all was. I should mention this story has a really good ending. Like the kid did great. He's had 3 surgeries and it's all good, which speaks to modern medicine.
Yeah.
But it also speaks to something that we all deeply agree about. And Jimmy Kimmel pointed this out and it stays with me, which is all of us, regardless of whether or not we're Democrats or Republicans or anything else, really care about our kids' healthcare. And I think all of us would like to say that money shouldn't get in the way of our kids living.
Right.
right? So with that in the recesses of my mind, you wrote something in this article, and folks, we're going to drop this into the show notes, the article, both about the robots and about embryo donation. What you wrote was, what IVF represents above all is a path to parenthood. And in that deeply held bipartisan desire, there's ample room for common ground. And that really struck me because we often are so focused on how we're different, like the 3% where we're different, that we forget what we're alike.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, this is a story that I think the one thing this has in common with the robot story is that it sort of followed an obsession that I had or something I've been fascinated with, a fascination. Journalism gives you this great opportunity to follow that rabbit hole and ask questions of people and call people up and ask them really personal questions and have the honor and privilege of them giving you really personal answers. So this was a fascinating one to work on. I learned about it because I was at my college reunion years ago and saw a classmate who had a baby with her, like a toddler. And the classmate, I will say, was like a Latina woman, and she had this blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby. And someone said, "Oh yeah, she adopted an embryo." And I had never heard of that before. I say that with kind of scare quotes around it because it's a somewhat controversial term to even say adopting an embryo. But the bottom line is when couples go through IVF, in vitro fertilization, they usually produce more embryos than they are likely to use that will wind up being children because many, many things can happen along the way in the process of growing these embryos. The way IVF works is that an egg is extracted and the egg is fertilized in a petri dish with the sperm, and it becomes a cluster of cells that grows into something called a blastocyst. In about 5 or 6 days, it has about 100 to 200 cells, and the blastocyst is reimplanted in a uterus and may or may not then implant and become a pregnancy. So it's like many, many steps.
And what's really interesting about this is that it doesn't always take, right?
Correct.
So the physicians will create many embryos, sometimes 20 or 30 embryos, because they want to be sure that they have enough in case it doesn't take.
Right.
Now,
Some won't survive. Some will have genetic abnormalities. Some will just stop growing for reasons we don't know. Some will be implanted and they won't take. There are so many things that happen that we either know or don't know why that will prevent these embryos from becoming babies.
I met a woman last week at a conference. She's in her early 40s, and she and her partner have both carried a pregnancy. They have two very healthy, wonderful kids. They also have a bunch of embryos. Each of them have a bunch of embryos which are in frozen storage, along with sperm that are expensive to the tune of almost $5,000 a year for all of that. It's
Right.
about 500 maybe to 1,000 per year to store those embryos. They've got that times 2 plus the sperm storage, and it becomes real money.
Yeah, embryos are stored in liquid nitrogen in these little containers that are kind of like straws. And a lot of couples that I've spoken to have gone through IVF not even realizing that this could be a consequence. You go through it so fixated on having your family. And when it's successful, it's a miracle and it's amazing. And then you all of a sudden are confronted with this question of what do you want to do with your extra embryos? And it's a very wrenching and challenging question for people, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, because wherever you think life begins, which is a moral and philosophical question that has been politicized, you still feel an attachment to these embryos, which in some other random circumstance could be a child, could be your child, if a lot of other things go right.
What are the options? If a couple decides to do IVF, they go through this process you've just described and now have embryo, which they've not used, but they may want in the future. Maybe they don't want it in the future. They're not exactly sure. What are their options?
Well, so you could store it at an annual cost that could be $500 to $1,000 a year. You could have them destroyed. If you take them out of cold storage, they will stop growing. You could have them donated to medical science. So there's research that can be done on those embryos that goes toward curing diseases, medical research, or you can donate them to another family. And that's something that fertility clinics have always had the opportunity to do. They don't really have the infrastructure, and because of HIPAA rules, because of healthcare privacy rules, if you received another family's embryos, you would not be able to ask about their medical history. You wouldn't be able to know all of the information that you might want to know if you were adopting a baby through traditional adoption. So a lot of families would like to know that history. So about 20 years ago, there was a Christian couple, very, very religious and devoted to their faith, and they were in this scenario. And they had gone through fertility treatments. They weren't successful. They realized that there was this option of acquiring someone else's embryos. The fertility clinic could not give them information about the embryos. So they went to a friend of theirs who happened to run a Christian adoption agency. And they said, can we do an adoption? Can we make an arrangement that's like an adoption? And this agency, which is called Nightlight Christian Adoptions, created this program. They called it Snowflakes as kind of a reference to these frozen embryos that they thought of as potential children. And they kind of worked up this combination of a property transfer with the wrappings of an adoption. So embryos are considered property. Human tissue, according to US law, cannot be bought or sold. So they have to be donated. But there's a whole infrastructure that Snowflake's built around it where it's very much like traditional adoption, where people create these presentations about themselves and they go through medical testing. On the receiving end, they go through a home study, and this agency works to match families that have similar perspectives and preferences and then facilitates this embryo transfer. So a couple that wants to have a baby can acquire these embryos, implant the embryos, and go on with a pregnancy that may or may not take, but can result in a baby. And so there are thousands over the last 20 to 22 years, there have been thousands of babies born through this process who are known in that community as snowflake babies.
It's fascinating because it really is like an adoption, right? Where you go through this process and people can feel 100% comfortable that if they're going to donate their embryos, that this is going to end up in a family who will take good care of this child. And they even stay connected, don't they? I think I read in your article.
Yeah, they can choose their preferences. So in some cases, the families have mutually decided that they want to have a relationship and they want to share information. So I've heard stories of people sending pictures, the child as the child grows. I've heard of people visiting, having like physical visits where a donating couple will bring their children to meet their biological siblings who are being raised by another family. And these really complex and fascinating and rich relationships develop. But I will
Right.
say, the adoption terminology is controversial. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine advises people not to use that adoption terminology. They call it misleading. They say it can lead to a lot of different complications legally. And so there is a growing movement among secular agencies, so people who are not Christian, who maybe come at this from a more practical perspective, who still think, well, this is a fascinating and useful and valuable way for people to create families. It's another way that we can use this amazing assisted reproductive technology to help people who want to become parents.
Especially because when you talk about the full process of in vitro fertilization, this is expensive, right? Like a round of IVF easily costs 20 to
Yes.
$30,000, and frequently you need to do that a couple of times. Some in some cases 3 times. And so you're talking about real money here, 60, 70 more
Yeah.
$1,000 for the process, whereas this costs a lot less, right?
This typically costs nine or $10,000 to acquire embryos with all of the kind of wrapping, all of the services that go around that acquisition, including legal services that facilitate this property transfer, but then also do the kind of family law component so that you are assured to have custody of the children that would grow from these embryos. So it's a complicated thing, but it's much less expensive. If you take away the religious wrapper, it becomes more accessible to LGBTQ families. It becomes maybe more accessible to single parents or just to people who don't feel comfortable entering that religious faith-based environment but want to have these services and want to facilitate these transfers. Also, it's an alternative to using an egg donor or a sperm donor. And there's some families who decide, well, instead of using the gamete, the egg or sperm from just one parent, maybe both of us are not biologically related. And different families just come to different conclusions about how they want to build their families.
That's a really interesting point. Should a mother donate her egg to this, but the husband not be able to fertilize that with his sperm, so use other sperm, that creates an imbalance in some way that I hadn't considered. Whereas if you are donated an embryo, then neither the mother nor the father have donated sperm or an egg. Instead, it's a whole new embryo.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, wonderful world, and different people have different perspectives and preferences. So it's just amazing that this technology has allowed for all of these possibilities. And there's just a growing number of these secular agencies who are saying, look, this is a solution that everyone should know about. Anyone who is trying to build a family, which is a large number of people who are going through infertility, which is a horrible, wrenching, painful process, and want that endpoint of a family and want that endpoint of children, this is another option that they should know about.
I think it's a really important one. I have a friend from medical school. When you're in medicine, you're just buried for all through your 20s, at least for that long. And she got to a point in her life where she wanted a family, but because she was so committed to her profession, she hadn't found someone. And she went ahead and did this. Did not do it through an embryo donation, but went through IVF and was able to have a son. And that has turned out to be wonderful for her. She's now married and they have a family, but that would not previously have been possible. And now it is.
Well, and the wrinkle and the reason this is a story for Politico is that IVF has been lately politically challenged. And IVF itself is controversial in some circles. And it really goes back to where your belief system is and where you think that life begins ultimately, which is this kind of unanswerable question, but a question that's become politicized and that has become pretty inextricably wrapped up in the abortion debate. And now we go back 50 years to Roe v. Wade. Someone from ASRM, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, pointed this out to me. I hadn't realized this. Roe v. Wade passes the Supreme Court the year before IVF technology becomes commonplace in the United States. And this didn't make it into the story, but this stuck with me. He said he feels like the whole history of reproductive rights might have been different if those chronologies were reversed, because with the opposition to Roe v. Wade, people centered that opposition fairly quickly on what is this fertilized? When does life begin? What does this fertilized egg represent? Is this fertilized egg life? And once a kind of political apparatus got built around defining life at the moment of fertilization, you were inevitably going to have a conflict with IVF.
That's a really interesting concept because context really is everything, right? And what
Yeah.
you're saying is, had IVF come first, then the context may have been altogether different. I want to wrap here by saying, you pointed out that this is not a political thing at all. This is a path towards parenthood, and it's one that's deeply held on both sides of the political divide. So that's what I found so interesting about it, and I thought it was a really well-written article.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate all the people I spoke to, some of who didn't even make it in, who just shared their stories, because it's a really fascinating personal journey for a lot of people.
Joanna, I'm going to transition us into something else, which is going to be a huge medical bill that my wife got. But before I get into a big medical bill, and more specifically, what you can do if you get that big medical bill, here's a word from our sponsor. C2 Sense is doing important work with its Halo platform, applying technological advances in chemistry, machine vision, and material science to provide both patients and providers with laboratory-level accuracy at low cost when they need it. C2 Sense's goal is to use their patented technology to ensure the same quality of testing you would find in your doctor's office in the comfort of your own home. So if you're suffering from upper respiratory symptoms like cough, sore throat, nasal congestion, or a headache, keep your eyes out for C2 Sense as they're developing tests targeting upper respiratory conditions such as COVID and flu. If you want to learn more, see what they're up to at haloreader.com.
So, Kevin, I have a question for you, if it's okay to turn the tables here. I saw you recently and you were telling me about an insane medical bill that you got. I've had stories of insane medical bills, many people have, but I want to hear you walk through yours and how nutty this is.
Yeah, I've talked about this before on the podcast, Joanna, about people getting bills. When you get a bill, is your go-to to pay the bill? I'm talking medical bills.
Usually, yeah, because I don't want collecting agencies knocking down my door.
Exactly. It is like the number one cause of bankruptcy personal bankruptcy in this country is unpaid medical bill. So most people, when they get the medical bill, they might let out a small curse or, kick the sand or something, but they end up paying the bill.
Well, and you assume it's gonna be expensive because you hear the stories of the $100 aspirin at the hospital and stuff, right? So you're like, "Oh, it's everything's expensive."
Exactly. Context is everything. And you put it in the context, well, I know healthcare is expensive and I'm going to figure out how to pay this bill. If you don't stroke a check right away, what oftentimes people do is call the provider group or the hospital or whatever it is, and they may work out a payment plan, which is something people can do. But even before then, I think you have to question the bill. So my wife went for her annual wellness visit, just like her yearly checkup. And that is covered. The Affordable Care Act made those types of visits covered by commercial insurance. And despite this, later she got a bill for $679.89 and $127.77.
2 different bills because that's how medical billing works.
Exactly. Like, it can't be one bill. Right, 2 different bills, and you think I would have added up 127 and 679, but I didn't, and I didn't know there was gonna be on the spot math. That's like over $800, right?
For a well visit.
Yeah, for it, right. I'm holding the bill in my hands. It gives me plenty of information about how to pay the bill, but it doesn't say what the bill is for.
Because you never get an itemized bill from a doctor's
Never,
office.
never. You will not get that. So, the very first thing that I did was I called. Well, actually, you know what I did? The very first thing I did was I waited, because you know how, like, oftentimes you just kind of have to wait it out and they send you a bill and then you get something a little bit later and all of that has gone away. And so you just play the waiting game and you're like, this will clear up.
Yeah, God will intervene, right? Like, someone will intervene in my medical
Exactly, and God did not
financial mess,
intervene. God did
right?
not intervene, and I kept getting the same bill. This bill came from the hospital, and I was like, "Oh, this has to do with testing of some sort," because she went to her doctor's office, but now I'm getting a bill from the hospital, and I'm like, "Well, it had to be, like, blood tests." I called, and I asked for an itemized bill. I can't even tell you how difficult that was, because they started to quote HIPAA and all these other things, and they didn't, because it wasn't me. And as it turns out, my wife is Italian. She was back in Italy with our kids, and so it actually wasn't that easy to get
Oh, you couldn't
her.
even get her information because it was you, not
So that
her.
took.
Even though she was your spouse? HIPAA, I don't get.
Here's the thing, like, I didn't even ask her anything. I just said, "Hey, can you send an itemized bill to the address on file?" This ends up eventually working. What I would have had to do is have her call in and give me permission for me to ask for that. But all of it took so long that I started to get close to that time period when they report you to collections, which is about 3 or 4 months at this hospital, because I asked them that question. And sure enough, I finally get the itemized bill. Sure enough, it's like for a metabolic panel, which is, think electrolytes, sodium, potassium, your kidney function, your glucose.
Blood tests, these are blood
Blood
tests.
tests, but these are not like expensive blood tests or weird blood tests. These are just common blood tests. Her lipid panel, a complete blood cell count, okay? And I looked at this and I was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold on. This is covered by the Affordable Care Act."
Which not everybody probably
Well,
knows.
that's the thing. I would not expect people to recognize what these labs are or to know that they're covered by the Affordable Care Act. So what I did is I called the insurance company and I said, "Hey, I'm sitting on these bills, 679, 127, and they look to be for labs that are straightforward and covered by the Affordable Care Act, because I wanted to come in with guns blazing, right?" And the guy said, "Oh yeah, they got coded wrong."
So it was like one little input error that was the difference between $0 and 800 something dollars that you owed.
Exactly. Exactly. And I will tell you, when this all happened, I did give thought to just paying the bill, but then I was like, wait, this makes no sense to me. So I almost fell trap to something that I talk about all the time. They said, "Hey, oh geez, at the hospital they coded it wrong, so it came across to us as basic labs, but not connected to the annual wellness visit, and therefore you owe nothing. You or do a refund," which I hope the insurance company would give me. Instead, they said, "No, no, the hospital will give you either a credit or will refund you your money. And I'm like,
Great, a credit at the hospital, like, it's not really what you
and I should
want.
mention that that hospital or that system laid off like 800 people last month. And so I do not want a credit from this hospital. I want my money back, but it takes time. And I'm looking to see if I have the date, but the date of service for this was back in April. So here we are in October, and I'm still working on
It's
this
not
thing.
resolved. I mean, I feel like, and I know this a little bit because I worked in healthcare for a little, and I've had relatives working in healthcare. Knowing what coding is and how much coding matters is so important. There's a little part of my brain that's constantly working on managing medical bills, and I've had these phone calls where you're on the phone with the insurance company that sends you to the provider, that sends you back to the insurance company, and you need to get them to code it correctly. You need to ask with the right trigger language, how can you code this in a way that is not gonna charge me for something I shouldn't be charged for?
Here, I think, are the takeaways that I glean from it all. Number one, don't just pay a bill. Make sure that you get the itemized bill. If you get the
Mhm.
itemized bill and it somehow makes perfect sense to you, then by all means, go ahead and pay the bill. But if you want clarity or explanation, get the itemized bill by calling either the provider group or the hospital or wherever it comes from, and call your insurance company and ask them to walk you through this bill. And it's very possible because they are more sophisticated and deal with this on a daily basis, potentially more sophisticated, then it may be that this is not a bill that you have to pay and they can change it. But at the very least, just don't pay the bill straight up. I believe you should push back a little bit by having some better understanding of what this bill is all about.
Yep, ask questions, and these insurance companies all have customer service people on staff who are there to answer those questions.
I started this off by talking about the change from sick health with Kevin Ban to well defined. I think there are a couple of reasons why that is. When I started this journey, let's call it, I really was reacting to a broken healthcare system, at the very least, a very complicated healthcare system. And I wanted to help people navigate through it. And that has not changed. So I want to continue to do that. But there's something else that I really wanted to get into, and that's just what's on my mind and what I find interesting. And I wanted it to be more of a curiosity journey. What I realized, and I took a break this summer for a bit to think about this, is that I want this to be a journey for me to better understand this world. And I thought well defined was a better title, simply because at times, I will talk about wellness and how it's defined. But other times, I may just be looking to define something well and something that has nothing to do with healthcare.
Well, and wellness is not always a function of the healthcare system, right? You can be well in a lot of ways. You can be well by starting a band with your friends and having a fantastic time and adding something to your life that you didn't have. You can be well by following your curiosity or understanding the world in a different way that makes you feel better about humanity. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to define things well and to define what well is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That captures it perfectly. I don't want to be sort of in this box of I can only talk about healthcare. It felt somehow confining to me. This is the first episode where we got outside of the healthcare box and we talked about non healthcare related things. And I really enjoyed it.
Well, I will always come talk to you about robots, Kevin. Just call. Just send out the bat signal, and I will come and talk about
You are
robots.
my robot go to person. I love your work. I want you to come back on the show. I think we've made a commitment to both wear continuous glucose monitors, which have been FDA approved for people who are not diabetic for, let's just say, a week or two. And then we'll do a podcast and talk about it.
Yeah, I'm a Fitbit delinquent. Like, I had one for a while, and then I just kind of gave up. I got tired of counting my steps and trying to do that, like, extra 300 steps around your bed at night to hit your goal. So I'm kind of a delinquent, but for you, Kevin, yes, I would wear a glucose monitor.
All right, we're going to make that happen. And then I know that you're working on some other crazy stories. You got some high drama in the wildlife world thing you're working on. And I want you to come back to talk about it.
I would love to.
With that, I'm going to thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thanks, Kevin.
And thanks to all of you for listening. I want to hear your thoughts about the episode. Do you have any questions? Are there topics that I should cover? If so, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer. That's our show for today. The show was produced by me and Batsheva Gez. Until next time, be well.